Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. So nice to be with you on this Wednesday morning as we are making the grade. Yes, we are talking all things education. And as always, since we are live here, I want to let you know that we are anxious to take your thoughts, your comments, your questions on anything regarding education in the state of Idaho. We're going to be talking about a number of topics, everything from what's happening in the State House to what's happening on our university campuses. And here to join me with the expertise he provides every week on making the grade, Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Michelle. How are you?
I'm good. First and foremost, you are trying to cover the legislature virtually, and so much that happens in the legislative session every year has to do with education. So I know it's been difficult for you and the team at Idaho Ed News, but let's just jump in because there have been already, as we well know, a number of hot topics coming out of there. And I wanted to begin with what you were reporting on with a possible emergency funding for virtual charter schools. So online schools who have had this rapid increase in enrollment because of the pandemic are looking for extra money, but it seems like it should be cut and dry. It's not, though, correct?
No, it's really kind of a complicated situation. And what happened during the pandemic, not surprisingly, you had hundreds and hundreds of students move from more traditional schools to virtual charter schools, to the point where two of the virtual charter schools are looking for about $7.6 million of emergency funding from the legislature just to handle all of this kind of meteoric growth. Idaho Idaho Virtual Academy is one of the charters we're talking about here. They saw their enrollment double this year as opposed to last year, and as a result, the school added about 70 full-time staffers, and now they have to figure out how to pay for it. The problem that the virtual charters are running up against is years ago the legislature imposed a cap on the growth of charter school funding. They limited the amount of new funding a charter school could receive from one year to the next. Well, with all of this enrollment growth, these two virtual charter schools are far exceeding that cap. So right now they're in a funding hole. So the situation that we saw unfold with the Senate Education Committee yesterday is, how do we fix this problem? I didn't hear any senators say that the state shouldn't fix this problem and shouldn't pay these charter schools for taking on these added students. And we're talking about like about 1,200 added students just in Ada and Canyon counties are going to these two virtual charters. I think everybody wants to get some sort of a funding fix. The legislature seems to be on board with that, but they're not really sure they want to lift this cap, and they're not really sure they want to take the money out of a state savings account. They would rather see the money come from federal coronavirus aid. So it gets really complicated really quickly. The short answer is I think something will happen, but it's probably not going to happen in the next few days, which means that these charter schools are going to be waiting a few months to get any additional money.
So back me up a little bit here, because what it sounds like you're talking about is that the Senate Education Committee is a little bit worried about how to make the process work in order to get them more money. So
Exactly.
take me to the ground level of these virtual charter academies. What happens if they don't get the money quickly? How fast do they need it? Do they run out of money? Can they not hire more people if the pandemic lingers?
Well, I don't think we really know all of those answers right now, but I know that the concern that the charter schools have is that they feel like they've already hired these people, they've already taken on the expense, they've already taken on these added students. Their hope was to get this money immediately. And all the schools, public schools, charter schools, get a large payment from the state every February. It's one of the big payments of state funding that goes out to all the schools, and that's going to go out in the next couple of weeks. As it stands right now, these two schools will get the same amount of money that they would get under the existing law, which has that cap on funding. So these schools are going to be having to do without this money for at least a couple of months. So, it's a good question. What kind of a short-term budget crunch does this create for the two schools?
Well, we'll continue to watch that and see if the legislature makes any moves before those checks are actually cut. That'll be fascinating. The other story I wanted to touch on coming out of the Senate and House Education Committees happening right now is that they've taken up Governor Brad Little's summer reading program. He wants to have $20 million placed into a summer reading program to make sure that kids who, because of the pandemic, literally have fallen behind in reading, specifically kindergarten through third graders, that they would be able to get caught up during a summer reading program. It seems on that nobody should have necessarily a problem with that unless they have a problem with the amount of money being sent or where the money's coming from. But I mean, everybody wants kids reading. So what's the hang up here, Kevin?
There's a little bit of resistance to this idea that came up in the House Education Committee on Monday. And I think it's just a concern right now about, how would this money be spent? What would this do? I think one of the legislators, Dorothy Moon, Republican from Stanley, said, well, literacy is kind of a feel-good program, but what exactly would this money do? What exactly would happen here? What the state envisions here is a part-time 6-week program for kindergarten through third grade kids who are not reading at grade level to get them extra help so that when they get back into school next fall, they'll be closer to grade level or at grade level. The State Department of Education, Sherry Ibarra and her staff strongly support the idea. They were back in House Education on Tuesday, voicing support for this, saying that it's part of a larger plan to try to address this learning gap, this gap for kindergarten through third grade students. And we know there's a gap. We saw those reading scores come out this fall, and they are down from where they were a year ago. Not really surprising when you consider all of the upheaval that's happened in schools and all of the upheaval that's occurred in terms of how kids are learning to read at home or partly at home, partly in a classroom. So the scores are down. The concern is that these students are going to fall behind and fall further behind if they don't get some help in the next few months. So that's why the summer reading program is such a big priority for the governor. And it's a big priority for Sherry Ibarra and the State Department of Education. And now we'll see if the legislature signs on.
And what about the hiccup of whether or not this would be virtual learning for these students or in person? Has that come up?
I think that was part of the concern that you heard in the House Education Committee earlier this week on Monday. I think the question is, is this going to be an in-person component or is it going to be virtual? And I think, that's a big concern with a lot of legislators. I think, they're really concerned about virtual learning, but, that's consistent. A lot of parents are, concerned about virtual learning and whether virtual learning is working as well for kids as the in-person experience. So, I think it's an extension of this whole debate about virtual versus in person in the middle of a pandemic.
Well, and that kind of leads me to my next topic with you, which is that Boise State always puts out the Idaho Public Policy Survey. And we've seen this for a number of years, education specifically at the top of people's concerns. But to do this survey, Kevin, during a pandemic and to try and figure out, and before the election, we should take it back because this was being done in the early part of December when this telephone survey was being done. So not only did you have a political component to it, but you had a pandemic component, and the results were interesting when you wrote about them.
Yeah, there really were. And what I focused in on, as you talked about, is the questions about the pandemic. Boise State has been doing this annual survey for several years. I think this was the 6th installment of this survey. And they try really hard to get a representative sample of the state, geographically, demographically. It's a survey of about 1,000 adults. It's done with phone surveys, but it's also done via text and via online because, as pollsters have noted, it's harder to get a hold of people now because fewer and fewer people have landlines. So, at any rate, the methodology is really important to remember. I mean, this is a meaningful survey. It's really one of the more impactful and I think important surveys we get of public opinion in the state. So all of that's a good segue to what did they find out. They asked some really interesting questions about the pandemic. and about the political response to the pandemic, and asked these 1,000 Idahoans where do they stand on K-12 education delivery. Do they support a mix between online and in-person learning? Do they support all in-person learning, or do they support all online instruction? And you can see the numbers. There's a real shift here between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are much more supportive of all in-person learning. I mean, 50% of Republicans said that's their preference is all in-person. Only 10% of Democrats support all in-person learning. 46% support a mix between in-person and online, which is kind of what you're seeing right now in the Boise School District, for example. And 37% of Democrats support all online learning. Only 8% of Republicans support all online instruction. And then when you talk to parents, you see a split that skews a little bit closer to where the Republicans are, a little bit more supportive of in-person learning, hybrid learning, a lot more skepticism about all online learning. But, you know, I guess what's not surprising here, Michelle, is that this survey and these results on K-12 learning are pretty, symptomatic and symbolic of what we're seeing in the larger debate about the pandemic. And when Boise State asked respondents, what are their biggest concerns about the coronavirus, you saw a partisan shift there as well. Republican respondents said they were more concerned about the economic impacts of the pandemic and the impacts on kids. Democrats more concerned about this and seeing it primarily as a consideration of public health. So, that ties into a lot of the debate that we're seeing as a nation about the pandemic and the pandemic response. So really interesting findings in terms of the pandemic. A lot of their findings in terms of education in general, fairly consistent with what we've seen in the past. You alluded to it already. Idahoans consider education to be their top priority issue. They think it's the most important thing for the legislature to take on again this year. We've heard that in the past. Kind of middle of the road grades in terms of the quality of the education system. Better grades when people are asked about their local schools. We've seen that before, that they get these results seemingly every year where if people are asked about their local schools, they're a lot more supportive. They're a lot more positive about the local education experience.
That was actually my takeaway from the survey results, was that, obviously Boise State and the survey they've never asked before about pandemic questions and whether or not schools should be opened or closed. Like, that's obviously was not on anybody's radar a year ago. So the questions that stood out to me were the ones specifically that have been asked before, so that you can kind of do an apples to apples comparison, as you and I like to say. And it surprised me that more people, take this for what it's worth, it surprised me personally that more people weren't complaining about the education system, considering all of the hardships that parents and students and teachers have been through in this past year.
Yeah, it was really surprising to me too that when parents were asked to grade the local schools, I believe the number was that 55% said that they think that their local schools are good or excellent. And I'm not pinpointing that because I think it's an indictment on local schools. That's just very inconsistent with the numbers that Boise State found just a year ago, where they found, I think it was only about 38% of parents of kids said that they thought their local schools were good to excellent. So a really big increase in that, in light of everything that's happened in education, in light of all of the turbulence. And I kind of wonder if what you got in the survey was respondents saying, we get it. We know how difficult this past year has been for the education system, as well as how difficult it's been for parents. So I think maybe there's a little bit of a sense of, I don't know if sympathy is the right word, but maybe more of a sense of support for what schools are trying to do under really difficult circumstances.
If people want to link to this survey, it's there on
It's all there.
idahoednews.org, the
Yes.
whole thing. So you can go and take a in-depth look if you want to look at one particular topic. Kevin, this kind of leads us to the discussion I want to have with you about the battle for funding for higher education. And if you were with us on Making the Grade last week, we alluded to the fact that Education Week, which was last week, when all of the college and university presidents would present to JFAC, the budget committee at the State House, their thoughts about what needs to happen with higher education funding. Of course, Governor Little has proposed an increase to higher ed funding, and the universities have backed his budget proposal, even to the point of the president saying that if the legislature were to pass the governor's budget proposal for higher ed, that they would be able to freeze tuition rates yet again for students. It got contentious, though, as we thought it would be. Specifically for Dr. Marlene Tromp, the Boise State University president, as she took some heat for what had been happening on campus. So instead of going all the way back, because people probably have been following the story, give me your read on where things stand this week when it comes to higher education funding.
Well, it's kind of, it sets the stage for where I see this playing out in the next few weeks, because now we're at a stage where it's going to be a couple weeks, maybe several weeks, before we see the budget committee come out with its spending plan for higher education, and how that compares to the governor's proposal. We will see. But what you saw in that budget committee this week were a couple of legislators in particular, Ron Nate and Priscilla Giddings, two conservative House members, really hardline conservatives, who are on the budget committee for the first time, asking some really, really pointed questions of the university presidents. And you alluded to Marlene Tromp was grilled on social justice issues during her presentation. So what I see happening here, and what I saw happening last week as the college and university presidents made the rounds, I think there's a lot of resistance on the higher education budget on the House side. The House is just more conservative. There are a lot more hardline right-wing conservatives in that chamber as opposed to the Senate. And if you remember last year, it was really difficult to get a higher ed budget through the House. It took 3 tries to get the House to sign on to a higher education budget. So that's where the battleground is going to be. And I think that was illustrated last week. Senate has been a lot more sympathetic to higher education in past years. And the only thing that I could kind of use as a gauge from last week was when the college and university presidents did their Zoom presentation with the Senate Education Committee. Very receptive audience. One senator did ask President Trump a social justice question, but it was almost apologetic. He asked it in a way of, well, we've got to talk about the elephant in the room, President Trump, and let's talk about social justice and what is Boise State doing about the perception that this is an emphasis. I mean, he was really kind of backing into it. The senator who asked that question, Carl Crabtree, also sits on the budget committee. He's a pretty influential member of the Senate. It gives you a sense, though, of maybe where the sentiment might lie if a higher education budget ever gets through the House and gets over to the Senate, which will happen. I'm being facetious when I say if, but it's going to be a tough battle in the House, and maybe one of the most interesting floor fights we see this session.
Do you see the State Board of Education, perhaps even the governor's office, stepping up their rhetoric when it comes to trying to pass this higher education budget? Are they going to get involved?
That's a good question, and I think that's a real possibility. I think the state board members, especially, who deal with the university presidents and deal with the college presidents and deal with the inner workings of the higher education operations, I think they realize, and I know from talking to them in past interviews, I think they realize the level of belt tightening that's already occurred on the campuses and has just intensified during the pandemic. I think there's a real realization that on the state board's part that higher education needs some help. They need some funding. So how active, how vocal does the state board get on this issue? That's a really good question. But it would not surprise me at all if you saw the state board kind of go to bat for the governor on this budget.
Real quickly, before I let you go, Kev, because we like to track it. In fact, you love to track it. You get all the numbers out. Let's just quickly touch on, when we're talking about the higher education campuses, the fact that coronavirus cases are on the decline for the most part across the state. I mean, this is terrific news.
It really is good news in terms of trying to keep face-to-face learning occurring on the campuses. And the numbers that we're seeing for the four-year institutions, they're all dropping. And here we are a couple of weeks into the semester, and those numbers are dropping. So that's a good early sign, and it's in line with what we're seeing statewide. Statewide, the case numbers are dropping to the point where Governor Little relaxed some of the restrictions on, went from stage 2 to stage 3 of the state's reopening plan. So I think that as you see the case numbers dropping on the campuses, it definitely bodes well for the rest of spring semester. Did see an increase in cases from the K-12 community. Those numbers came out earlier this week. An increase, but not nearly the number of cases that we're seeing in K-12 that we were seeing last fall. So, we're a long way out. I mean, when we're just, we're early on in the vaccine process, a lot of uncertainty, obviously, with what's going to happen with the coronavirus variants and how that might affect case numbers in the state. But, a lot of the trends pointing in the right direction, at least for now.
And we should mention quickly, too, that when we talk about the higher ed case numbers, those professors and staff members are not in that first round of vaccinations. The first round of vaccinations were for preschool through 12th grade staff and teachers.
That's a good point. I mean, the vaccine has probably had virtually no impact on the higher education campuses because, as you note, K-12 teachers, K-12 staffers have been getting the vaccine now for a couple of weeks. Some of them are going to be probably pretty close to getting their second vaccines by now. Higher education professors, staff are not in that high priority group. They're going to be kind of coming in for vaccines in the weeks and months to come, like most other adults. And the same goes for students. College students are not eligible right now to get the vaccine. So what is happening with these case numbers on the campuses is happening with no measurable impact off of the vaccine.
Kevin, talk to me real quickly about what you're working on right now, because I know you've got a really interesting story that I think you're looking to publish at idahoednews.org on Thursday, if I'm correct. Yes. And it's taking, again, a hard look at some money numbers when it comes to the pandemic.
Yes, what I'm trying to do with this story on Thursday is to kind of foreshadow another big variable. When we're talking about budgets, when we're talking about the K-12 budgets and the higher ed budget, when we're talking about money for summer reading programs or money to run the college and university system, we're talking mostly about state dollars, money that you and I pay when we pay our 6% sales tax, or when we fill out that income tax and get that in here in the next few weeks or couple of months. The federal government is going to be sending K-12 and higher ed a lot of money in the weeks to come. I mean, the money's on the way. It's an outgrowth of that last coronavirus stimulus law that was passed right around Christmas, when you got your $600 stimulus payment. Well, education's getting some big payments too. The K-12 system is going to get probably about $176 million off of this new stimulus law. Higher ed, the number is about 72 million for the public institutions, and a fraction of that, about a quarter of that, goes directly to students. We're talking about a lot of money, and we're actually talking about more money for K-12 and higher ed than they saw with the first round of stimulus, the CARES Act, that was passed back in March. So a big chunk of money, and I'm really curious to see how that money winds up getting spent. We don't really have many clear answers about that, but I'm also curious about how that might affect the debates over the state budgets for education. So
Kevin,
we'll break down the numbers and we'll kind of set the stage on Thursday.
We saw with that first round of stimulus, though, when K-12 got the money from the federal government right in March, April time period, we saw that money, though, was really I mean, it comes through the state. It's not like it goes directly to every local school district. The state then has some say, correct, over how that money is divvied up. And in fact, the governor put together a couple of advisory task force to try and figure out how best to use that money.
You know, it's complicated and there are a lot of pots of money, but the one that I'm focusing on most with K-12, it's pass-through money, if you will. I mean, it goes through the state to the local school districts, and they have a lot of latitude about how to spend that money. I mean, it's got to be coronavirus related. It's got to be some sort of an expense that is an outgrowth from the pandemic. But within that, there's a lot of room for spending this money in a lot of different ways. And there's, that's the money that I'm focusing in on K-12.
Okay, just more fun things to track for us. Yes. I mean, I get excited hearing about it because I want to know what local school districts will do with that money, and I'm sure they've already had big plans for it. So
we've got a lot of stuff going on. I've got like a committee hearing that's frozen on my computer. I've got it on pause. I got to get caught up because there's a new bill regarding concealed weapons on school property. Want to find out the details of it. It's a brand new bill, so we haven't seen the bill yet. It hasn't been printed or published yet. So lots of moving parts right now.
And we appreciate that you're trying to do it all virtually. Way to go, journalist. If you'd like to read about any of these stories in depth, the team at Idaho Education News does a fantastic job. You can go to idahoednews.org. Of course, we link to most of their stories at idahonews6.com as well. There are plenty of things we didn't get the chance to talk about, and I would highlight specifically, there's a story if you want to read about what it's like to go back to a high school basketball game. That was just fantastic. There is a lawsuit that has been filed in the Wilder School District that might have some interesting implications to how learning is done there. So again, idahoednews.org, the place to go to read about all of those stories. Kevin, thank you for your time when you're so busy for making the grade.
Oh, anytime. Always happy to do it. Stay safe. Have a good week, Michelle.
Thanks, Kevin.